All right, thank you so much. I can't say how grateful I am to be a part of this um, conference with so many just brilliant people doing wonderful work. And it is always, intimidating sharing a panel with Jade because they always just make my mind sort of explode and rethink so many different things. But I've learned so much today. So in this talk, I'm going to actually discuss the U.S. South in ways that might sort of trouble locating the U.S. South distinctly within the global North versus the global South. Historically, I'm going to focus on the context of pesticide intensification in the U.S. and focus on cotton production in the South, emphasizing the ways that racism has been central to the acceleration and effects of the pesticide treadmill. Now, the term treadmills of production, which many of you are probably familiar with, has been used to describe the runaway economic and environmental effects of the technological intensification of agriculture, which lead to both increasing dependency on new technologies and escalated agricultural production. So the use of pesticides can lead to initial increases in productivity and profitability, but these boosts are quickly erased economically when increased production leads to declining prices for agricultural products. So economically, pesticides often benefit the farmers that adopt them the first, since they stand the most to gain from initial boosts in productivity. So the pesticide treadmill is obviously also ecological and environmental. So species targeted as pests can evolve resistance to chemicals that are applied over multiple generations. And these resistant species can spread more quickly when other species that predate them are destroyed by pesticides. For example, as many of you probably are well aware, there are almost 200 species that have known resistance to the widely used herbicide glyphosate in the present day in the United States alone. And within the paradigm of pesticide-intensive agriculture, obviously the solution to this problem is the use of even more chemicals, or the corollary idea that we just need to use data a tiny bit better to precision target particular pests. And this leads to a further acceleration of the technological treadmill and the pesticide treadmill. Now, the combination of agribusiness consolidation and policies favoring large-scale capital-intensive agriculture, as well as costly inputs such as chemicals, have contributed to the dramatic decline in the number of farmers in the U.S. over the past 100 years. The number of farms in the U.S. declined from over 6 million in 1920 to only roughly 2 million in the present day, while the average farm in the United States today is almost 4 times the size of the average farm in 1920 and far more highly capitalized. However, these aggregate numbers mask massive inequalities in land loss and farm loss. Around 18 million acres of land were owned by Black farmers in 1910 versus 1.5 million in 1997. In the 1960s alone, the number of Black farmers declined from around 74,000 to 45,000. And that's as compared to an only 20% decline, which is still significant among white farmers. Now, even adjusting for farm size, racism and land theft have been central to the decline of Black farm ownership. But as historian Adrian Petty has suggested, the either or framing of whether racism or scale bias has driven Black land loss can obscure the actual dynamics of land loss and agricultural consolidation. Racism surely aggravated the circumstances of Black farm owners, she writes, but asks, did racism ultimately place the entire class of small farm owners at a disadvantage as well? In this presentation, I'm going to emphasize that in the case of pesticide intensification and the pesticide treadmill, racism has animated the political and technological dynamics of chemical intensification and land loss. The chemicalization of U.S. agriculture, in fact, has deep roots in slavery and agricultural imperialism. The spread of cotton plantations throughout much of the U.S. South was built on the theft of native lands and the institution of slavery. In 1850, the U.S. cotton imported by capitalists in the UK represented over 616 million hours of labor in the fields by enslaved persons, and the product of over 1.1 million hectares of land obtained through direct theft and through coercive treaties. 50% of the cotton produced in the US in 1850 was produced on lands that were not a part of the US just half a century earlier. This system was also, and very closely connected to this, environmentally extractive. Gossypium hirsutum, the species of cotton that dominates global production in the present day, is a tropical perennial from Mesoamerica, but produced monoculturally on plantations year after year. It sucks wealth from the soil and contributes to intense erosion. The 1856 Guano Islands Act enabled US citizens to take possession of unclaimed lands containing deposits of guano and empowered the executive branch to use military force to reinforce these claims. And this was a central moment in the development of international US imperialism. In the wake of the abolition of the slave trade, the guano industry was sustained by new forms of racial coercion, including debt peonage and convict labor. This industry in turn was crucial to the maintenance of cotton in the US South on lands that were being exhausted after years of continuous production. And in the decades following the abolition of slavery in the US, the emergence of a phosphate fertilizer industry in Florida and South Carolina was built upon racialized coercion. Of course, this expanding web of extraction and ecological degradation wasn't the inevitable context or consequence of cotton itself. Instead, the overthrow of Reconstruction and the failure of the promise to redistribute land to Black Southerners, as well as the interrelated violent restitution of the power of landowners over Southern politics, solidified the hold of cotton plantations in the US South. Throughout the South, the criminalization of Black freedom and mobility foreclosed alternatives to the sharecropping system. Debt fueled a cycle of fertilizer-based intensification, allowing merchants and landowners to dictate production terms, even as planters and smaller farmers entered relationships of debt with suppliers of credit and inputs. And for sharecroppers and tenants, these debts were passed on with added interest by landowners who deducted from tenants' crops. Because of these pressures, many tenants were required to purchase fertilizers on debt, trapped both by design and by the workings of a system in a cycle of cotton, debt, and the use of commercial fertilizers. And as a consequence, by 1910, over 70% of commercial fertilizers used in the United States were used in the United States South. So fertilizers, debt, and coercion form the interlocking elements of a system built upon racism as an ordering principle of economic and ecological extraction, and one that was highly ecologically vulnerable. And I'd like to briefly mention my colleague Jason Porter at Northwestern University. We've been collaborating to actually trace some of this history. Now, monocultural cotton not only erodes soils, it's highly vulnerable to predation by insects. By the 1870s, when plantation owners began using arsenical insecticides against cotton insects, the systemic toxicities of white supremacy were extended through poisonous compounds with profound effects on workers' health. The use of calcium arsenate against the cotton boll weevil quickly became important to the global chemical industry. In years of high weevil infestation and high cotton prices, the global market price of arsenic rose dramatically, only to sink during years in which cotton prices were low and the weevil was relatively dormant. Between 1919 and 1929 alone, the volume of insecticides used in the US roughly quadrupled, and calcium arsenate usage in cotton drove this increase. The aerial application of pesticides on fields by airplane, now a practice that can be found in many regions globally, had its origins in the Mississippi and Louisiana Delta in the 1920s. This provided for pesticide application at a new scale, as hundreds of acres of cotton could be covered in calcium arsenate in a single flight. According to early pesticide researchers, the largest plantations were ideal for crop dusting because of their consolidated ownership of land. So land monopolization provided a sort of ideal environment for the intensification of pesticides. And calculations of the profitability of poisoning done by people at universities like Mississippi State did not take the health of workers who were most likely to be exposed into consideration. Rather, experiment station workers compared the cost of insecticides and the cost of labor against the possible profit from increased cotton yields while attempting to minimize the toxicity of calcium arsenate to cotton. To put it differently, the health of cotton was given precedence over workers' lives. White monopolization of land, racially coercive labor arrangements, and a racist refusal to consider the health and well-being of workers formed the foundations of a rapidly expanding chemical industry in the US South, and for that matter, the United States as a whole. And following World War II, new classes of synthetic agricultural chemicals entered cotton production. Most prominently, organophosphates, a class of chemicals that were first developed as chemical weapons against people, and chlorinated hydrocarbons such as DDT, which persist in the environment and bodies. By 1950, as insects began to develop resistances to these chemicals, extension agents were recommending over 20 pounds of toxic mixtures per acre. Almost all the chemicals recommended in the table on the right are now banned for harm to people and environments. These chemicals were clearly dangerous to workers in the field, but they were also prone to drift beyond the field. And this brings me to an important point. Environmental racism through chemicals is not limited to direct exposure of people. It extends to the contamination of environments and the resources on which people depend. So cotton fiber obviously is not edible to humans, and cotton seeds contain the toxic compound gossipol. So cotton monocultures in plantation regions of the South represent a vivid example of what Karen Washington terms food apartheid. Under these conditions, small gardens around tenant houses represented veritable oases in an expanse of cotton. But calcium arsenate is not just toxic to people, it is also toxic to many plants, including the vegetables people grew in gardens. So insecticides also contributed to a closure of alternatives to plantation agriculture. But with the introduction of herbicides, the role of chemicals in environmental dispossession accelerated. By 1930, many agricultural researchers, plantation owners, and policymakers were beginning to focus on eliminating what they termed labor bottlenecks in cotton production. Cotton could be produced more productively and efficiently, they believed and argued, through the elimination of unnecessary expenses. In these calculations, workers' lives are reduced to labor expenses calculated against technological expenses. This figure, for example, which was produced by Mississippi State University researchers in the early 1930s, for example, graphically argues that replacing workers with tractors results in greater profitability through reduced expenditures and increased productivity. And we definitely see echoes of that in some of the ways that agriculture is being envisioned in the present day. And with the New Deal's Agricultural Adjustment Act, intended to address agricultural overproduction, plantation owners received a massive influx of capital to do just that. The cotton section of this act was written by plantation owners and their allies and provided no protection for landless tenant farmers. As planters evicted tenants and received subsidies for reducing acreages of cotton, acreage devoted to cotton, they reinvested this capital into tractors and machines. With the advent of the mechanical cotton picker, planters and researchers eyed the opportunity for the full mechanization of cotton. In the popular imagination, the mechanical cotton picker is often emblematic of the mechanization of agriculture more broadly, as well as massive shifts in the dynamics of racism and labor in Southern agriculture. But the mechanical cotton picker depended upon a number of things. First, successful mechanization of cotton required standardized cotton and was based upon a limited variety of commercialized seeds, like those sold by the massive Delta and Pineland plantation, which is now a seed and biotech subsidiary of Bayer. Secondly, successful mechanization required the use of defoliants, which were sprayed over the top of cotton and caused it to lose its leaves prior to picking. Thirdly, successful mechanization required fields largely free of weeds, which was increasingly accomplished through herbicides in the 1950s and the 1960s. Critically, these three factors were interdependent, what you could call a technology package. And agricultural researchers and extension agents at segregated white land-grant universities targeted most of the research and most of the development towards plantations. The timings, the techniques, and the scale dimensions were oriented towards plantation profitability. Structurally, this meant that the majority of research, work, and policy was geared towards large-scale white cotton farmers. But the structural biases of this technology package were reinforced by normative representations of ideals that equated whiteness and masculinity with being the right kind of cotton farmer. That is, the one who used the latest chemicals and produce the biggest yields. The interwoven racial and scale bias of USDA policy and practice pervaded every level of US agriculture. We can see this, for example, in Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, whose mantras, "get big or get out" and "adapt or die," both reflected and shaped agricultural and technological policy, and who was later forced to resign from making racist statements. Or Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland, one of the major shapers of US agricultural policy, who owned a cotton plantation, was a vocal racist and staunch defender of segregation. Or Jamie Whitten, a Mississippi congressman strongly allied with plantation and chemical industry interests, whose control over agricultural appropriations, and for a brief period environmental appropriations, was so great that he was dubbed the permanent Secretary of Agriculture, and for whom the headquarters of the USDA is actually now named. But the intersections of racism and scale bias are transformed into discriminatory practice at USDA county offices and in fields. By the 1960s, race was rarely a publicly stated reason for the denial of loans to Black farmers, and chemicals were part of a broader nexus of discrimination and the theft of Black-owned land. So to just give an example of how this works ideologically and materially, in 2016, I conducted an oral history with a former head of extension and county agent who headed extension over a county in the Mississippi Delta. Throughout our interview, he studiously declined to engage in depth with any questions I asked about racism or discrimination, and took pains to emphasize that no discrimination occurred in Sharkey County. However, at the end of the interview, he couldn't resist volunteering a story in response to an earlier question I had about the difference between successful and unsuccessful farmers. He said, "I can think of one farmer, and I don't want to get into black and white, but you decide what you want to do. This is a Black farmer, well-read, a smart man, but when all of his neighbors have gotten the cotton about this high, he's fixing to plant cotton. And you come out there and other farmers have already plowed their weed control. He's fixing to get his spray rig going to control weeds. He's always fixing to do something, but he wasn't timely. He was always behind, and that farmer's not going to be successful." That this agent offered this story as an example of a prototypical unsuccessful farmer takes on far greater significance, since Black farmers were frequently delayed precisely because of USDA discrimination. Chemicals were part of a more broad set of dispossessive technologies and practices through the USDA and through extension and through corporations. Often Black farmers were loaned an initial sum by the FHA, only to be refused later loans for necessary fertilizers and pesticides, even as chemical intensive agriculture was boosted by the USDA as the right and the most advanced way of farming. This was used as a means of forcing Black farmers into a default on their initial debt, one of the many means by which Black land was stolen in the South. And I'd like to emphasize that the agent who said this would have been one of the people who were key in determining whether or when a farmer received a loan. The dispossessive implications of having to plant late were also biophysical, part of the broader political ecology of chemical intensive development. Wendell Paris, a civil rights activist and organizer with Black agricultural cooperatives in the 1960s, described the process to me this way: "If you didn't get planted at the same time that the larger farmers planted around you, then by the time they started defoliating, if your crop hadn't finished maturing, so you're going to defoliate before the crop matures, then needless to say, that's a loss to you." So it did accelerate those folks leaving farming and moving away from the land, separating from the land, because of all those kinds of tactics that they were using then. The 1997 Pickford v. Glickman ruling and the subsequent Claims Resolution Act was the result of decades of struggle, advocacy, and legal challenges by Black farmers. It represented a legal acknowledgement of systemic discrimination against Black farmers by the USDA, yet the compensation provided through the Claims Resolution Act did not account for discrimination prior to 1984, and for many Black farmers, given the increasingly capital-intensive nature of corporate agriculture, the settlement provided no path back into growing commodity crops. Finally, as Adrian Petty emphasizes, the framing of the settlement effectively made compensation dependent upon isolating race from scale and left the corporate consolidation of agriculture untouched. From the very birth of the chemical industry, however, racism has been central to the growth of chemical intensive agriculture and the consolidation of agriculture. The analytical separation of racism from the politics of technology intensification can serve to preserve one of the key dimensions of agricultural and environmental racism. The ostensibly race-neutral deployment of technologies profoundly shaped by racism and that disproportionately harm farm workers and disadvantage small farmers. But I'd like to emphasize that I'm not simply arguing that chemicals are the root of agrarian racism or that organic farming is inherently the solution to agro-environmental racism. Thinking back, guano can be considered organic fertilizer. And several key dimensions of the chemical treadmill that I've emphasized can be replicated with organic agriculture. The exploitation of workers, the monopolization of land, and the role of institutional discrimination in preserving or intensifying agricultural inequality aren't inherently solved by organic production or certification schemes, though they are antithetical to a more holistic conception of organic that understands environmental sustainability and social equity as necessarily interconnected. And it's been amazing to see so many people talk about the interconnections and highlight those today. Ultimately, any vision of sustainability that does not have land restitution and food sovereignty at its core risks preserving the toxic roots that help lead to the contemporary dominance of agrochemicals over many millions of acres of land in the United States and globally. Thank you.